He was just sitting on a street bench enjoying the evening silence when an arrogant passerby walked up and punched him. But a second later, the whole world froze because that man was Chuck Norris. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The evening air in the small Texas town carried that soft weight of dust and warmth that always came before sundown. The sky was painted in layers of fading orange and gold, the kind that made even the cracked sidewalks look peaceful. On the corner of Main Street, beneath a flickering street lamp that hadn't been fixed in months, stood a modest little cafe with 2 rocking chairs and an old wooden bench out front. It was there that Chuck Norris sat, a man who had lived through decades of noise but now sought only the sound of wind brushing through his thoughts. He wasn't dressed like a legend or a fighter or the kind of man whose name could stop a room. He wore a plain denim shirt, sleeves rolled up, dark jeans, and a sun-faded cowboy hat that had seen better days. His boots were dusty from the trail behind his ranch, his shoulders straight, his breathing quiet and steady. In his hands rested a small paper cup of coffee, cooling slowly as he watched the horizon burn with color. People passed by now and then, some nodding, some waving with the polite familiarity that small towns never lost. "Evening, Mr. Norris," a man in a pickup called out. Chuck lifted his chin slightly in greeting, but said nothing. The silence suited him. Inside the cafe, the jukebox hummed a slow country tune from the 90s. The door creaked each time someone came or went. For everyone else, it was just another Friday ordinary, predictable, comfortable. But for Chuck, every evening was an act of meditation. He listened, not to music, not to cars, but to the rhythm of life itself. The sigh of wind through the mesquite trees, the distant barking of a dog, the hum of tires on asphalt, all of it merged into a single quiet reminder that peace still existed if a man cared enough to notice it. He took a sip of coffee, eyes soft under the brim of his hat. He remembered younger years, the roaring sound of arenas, the sting of sweat and competition, the endless need to prove. Fame had once been a loud, hungry thing, but age had turned it into something gentler, something wiser. He didn't need to be known anymore. He just needed to be still. Down the block, the first sound of chaos began to stir. Laughter loud, careless, the kind born of beer and bravado. 4 young men stumbled out of a sports bar, voices echoing across the quiet street. They were in their late 20s, their muscles still young, but their confidence already rotten. Among them walked one who carried himself differently, with the restlessness of a man who didn't know what to do with his own anger. His name was Troy Miller, a former amateur fighter who once thought he'd make it big, but injuries, debts, and disappointment had carved something hollow in him. He filled that space with pride. Troy's laughter rang sharp in the air as he nudged his friends and pointed down the street. "Hey, look at this," he said. "Some old guy sitting there like he owns the place." "Man, leave him be," one of the others muttered, already sensing where this was heading. But Troy wasn't the kind of man who left things be, especially not when someone looked calm. To him, calm meant weakness, or worse, indifference. It made his skin itch. He started walking toward the bench, the others following, half out of curiosity, half out of that shared stupidity that comes from alcohol and group laughter. Chuck saw them coming before they said a word. He didn't move, didn't even glance in their direction. He'd seen enough of the world to recognize trouble by the rhythm of its steps. 4 sets of boots scraping unevenly across pavement, loud, impatient, uncertain. He breathed in once, slow and deep, the way a man breathes before a storm. "Evening, old man," Troy said as he stopped in front of him, grin wide, eyes daring. Chuck didn't answer. He simply lifted his coffee cup to his lips. Troy chuckled. "What's the matter, huh? Cat got your tongue?" Still nothing. The silence hung thick between them, heavier than any insult. Chuck's stillness wasn't just physical. It was deliberate, carved from decades of discipline. It was the kind of calm that made lesser men uncomfortable because it forced them to face themselves. "You too good to talk?" Troy pushed. "Think you're better than me?" Chuck finally looked up, eyes hidden behind the shadow of his hat brim. His voice was low, even, almost gentle. "No, I just know there's nothing worth saying right now." The words were soft, but they struck like a hammer. The laughter behind Troy faltered. One of his friends shifted awkwardly, glancing away. Troy's face flushed. "You trying to be smart with me, old man?" Chuck turned his gaze back to the sunset. "Son, I don't have to try." That line cut deeper than any punch. The smirk on Troy's face hardened into something else: resentment. Wounded pride. That dangerous blend of humiliation and ego that turned conversation into conflict. His friends whispered something behind him, half warning, half taunt. And that was all it took. Pride is a poor master, and Troy had been its slave for years. He took another step closer, his shadow stretching over Chuck's boots. "You got a smart mouth for someone who's about to lose some teeth," he hissed. Chuck's eyes stayed on the horizon. "If you measure strength by what you can break, you'll spend your life surrounded by pieces." That sentence hung in the air like a test. The others looked at each other, unsure whether to laugh or walk away. But Troy's pride wouldn't let him back down. He clenched his jaw, fists tightening. "Say that again," he demanded. Chuck didn't. The silence that followed was answer enough. The kind of silence that doesn't just quiet the air, it challenges it. And Troy, who had never learned how to live without noise, felt it pressing on him like a weight. He finally turned away, muttering something about not wasting his time. But the damage was done. The seed of anger had been planted, and it would grow fast. As the group stumbled down the street, their laughter now forced and uneven, Chuck took another sip of his coffee. He didn't look after them. He didn't need to. Some lessons only life could teach, and this one was just beginning. The sky deepened to crimson, then violet. The town lights flickered on one by one. Across the street, the bartender locked his doors. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed, a long, lonely sound that faded into the horizon. Chuck sat quietly for a few more minutes, breathing slow and steady, letting the night settle. In his mind, he could already sense the path unfolding. He didn't need to see the boy again to know how this story would go. Men like Troy always came back. Pride never let them stay gone for long. He finished his coffee, stood, and adjusted his hat. The world was still warm, still glowing faintly from the last light of day. For a moment, everything felt perfectly balanced. Then he murmured to himself, almost a whisper carried off by the wind, "Storms always start small." And with that, he turned and walked into the fading evening, his footsteps calm, measured, unhurried, while somewhere behind him, a young man named Troy Miller burned quietly with the kind of anger that had only one destination. The night swallowed the sound of both their fates, leaving behind only the soft hum of the Texas wind. The next day broke hot and colorless, the kind of Texas morning where the air itself seemed heavy. Main Street was slower than usual, with most people tucked indoors behind air conditioners or in the shade of porches. Chuck Norris was already awake before sunrise, as always. He'd done his morning exercises, slow and deliberate, the old habits of discipline that had outlived every trophy, every headline. He moved with the kind of control that came not from muscle but from understanding, the precision of a man who no longer fought the world, but moved with it. By noon, he'd returned to his quiet bench near the cafe, coffee in hand, hat shading his eyes. For most, it was just another summer day. For him, it was practice in stillness. Troy Miller hadn't slept. The laughter of his friends from the night before kept replaying in his head, louder each time. That calm, indifferent old man had made him feel invisible. Every smirk, every quiet word Chuck had said seemed to echo inside him like a taunt. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. He'd convinced himself that the man's composure had been arrogance, not wisdom. Pride told him that peace was just a disguise for weakness, and Troy listened to pride like it was scripture. He spent the morning in a bar, staring at the condensation sliding down a beer bottle, his reflection warped in the glass. The bartender, a woman in her 50s who had seen too many men waste too many good years on their tempers, warned him softly, "You're looking for a fight, Troy. Don't go picking one you can't win." He laughed too loudly. "You think I'm scared of some old cowboy?" "No," she said, wiping the counter, "but maybe you should be." By evening, the sun had lowered again, burning the edge of the horizon in molten orange. Troy walked down Main Street alone this time, every step pulsing with the rhythm of self-justification. He kept replaying what he'd say, what he'd do differently, how he'd make that calm expression disappear. By the time he saw the cafe's sign, his fists were already curling and uncurling at his sides. Chuck was right where he expected, sitting on the same bench, in the same posture, the same faint half-smile that wasn't arrogance at all, though Troy couldn't see it that way. To him, it was mockery. "Evening, old man," he said, voice cutting through the calm like a blade. Chuck looked up slowly, just enough to meet his gaze. "Evening, son. You remember me?" Chuck studied him for a moment, then nodded once. Hard to forget a storm that still doesn't know it's raining. Troy frowned, not understanding but feeling insulted anyway. "You think you're funny, huh? You think just 'cause people know your name, you can talk down to anybody." "I don't talk down to anyone," Chuck replied quietly. "You do that to yourself." That simple, calm truth lit a fuse in Troy's chest. He stepped closer, jaw tight, his boots scraping against the pavement. "You know what your problem is? You think silence makes you better than the rest of us." Chuck's eyes didn't move from the fading sun. No, silence just makes it easier to hear the truth. Troy's friends from the night before weren't there this time. There were no witnesses to hold him back, no audience to second-guess his pride. And without them, his anger became sharper, cleaner, not just about Chuck anymore, but about everything, every failure, every time someone had laughed behind his back, every time life had said no. He lunged. There was no warning, no shout, just the dull rush of muscle and adrenaline as his right fist shot forward. The sound of the punch cracked through the air like a dry branch breaking. And then silence. Chuck didn't fall. He didn't flinch. The blow had landed clean across his jaw, but the old man's body hadn't even shifted. The moment froze, a second that stretched into something eternal. The only movement was Chuck's slow turn of the head back toward him. Troy blinked, confused. "What the hell?" said he. Chuck's voice was calm, measured, as if they were discussing the weather. "Now you know what noise feels like when it hits stillness." Before Troy could understand what that meant, before he could pull his fist back for another strike, Chuck moved. It wasn't fast in the way young men moved, wild and frantic. It was fast like lightning, silent, precise, over before the brain could catch up. A small shift of his foot, a twist of the hips, and his open palm pressed lightly into Troy's chest. For an instant, it felt like nothing. Then the force hit, not the kind of strength that breaks bones, but the kind that steals breath. Troy's body folded in on itself. Air ripped from his lungs as if the world had punched him back. His knees buckled. Chuck stepped aside as Troy stumbled forward, redirecting him with the same gentle guidance one might give a falling leaf. Troy hit the ground, gasping, clutching at his chest, eyes wide with shock. The street had gone still. Across the way, two people waiting for the bus had seen the whole thing. One of them lifted a phone, recording. Chuck looked down at Troy, adjusting his hat. "You measure power by the sound it makes," he said softly. "Real power doesn't need sound." He turned away, taking a slow step toward the cafe door. Troy wheezed, trying to speak, voice strangled and weak. What did you do to me?" "Nothing you didn't start yourself," Chuck said without looking back. "Anger always swings first. Wisdom just lets it finish." He walked away, his boots clicking against the pavement, fading into the quiet hum of dusk. The two bystanders approached Troy cautiously, one asking if he was all right. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His chest still burned from where that simple palm had touched him, and something deeper inside, something he couldn't name, had cracked. The man with the phone replayed the video. "Holy hell," he whispered. "That's Chuck Norris." By the time Troy struggled to his feet, the video was already on its way online, uploaded with shaking hands and an incredulous laugh. The caption would read later, "Guy punches old man. Turns out to be Chuck Norris." But Troy didn't know that yet. He only knew the weight in his chest, not pain, but realization, though he didn't understand it yet. He looked around, dazed. The sunset had vanished, replaced by the cold gray of twilight. Chuck was gone, leaving behind nothing but a quiet bench and the lingering echo of his words. As he staggered down the street, clutching his ribs, the laughter from last night came back to him. Only now it wasn't loud and confident. It was hollow, a ghost of arrogance that had already died. The next day would be different. By morning, the world would see what he'd done, and the name Troy Miller would be known. Not as a fighter, not as a man, but as a joke. And far away from that spreading storm of ridicule, Chuck Norris would be sitting once again in his quiet backyard, sipping tea, the faintest trace of sadness in his eyes. He had seen this story before, too many times. He knew how it began, and he already knew where it would go next. The night breeze carried away the dust, the hum of crickets rising again. Somewhere far down the street, a neon sign flickered to life, glowing red against the darkness. And in the middle of it all, beneath the indifferent stars, one man gasped for air, while another walked away in peace. Two ends of the same lesson, separated only by silence. By the time the first rays of sunlight hit the streets of the small Texas town, the video had already made its way across the internet. It started on a local social media page, then jumped to national feeds, and before noon, it was everywhere. The clip was short, just 30 seconds, but it was all the world needed. A man swings a hard punch at an old guy sitting on a bench. The punch lands squarely, but the old man doesn't move. He turns his head with the slowness of a mountain shifting, says something calm, and then with one graceful motion, the aggressor collapses to the ground. End of clip. Millions of views, thousands of comments. The title varied, but the most viral one read, "Guy punches random old man turns out to be Chuck Norris." The reactions came fast and merciless. Memes flooded timelines within hours. Some called it the fist of karma. Others said, gravity finally met its match. Late-night hosts joked about it. Reporters replayed it. Commentators turned it into a parable about respect. The soundless, still frame of Chuck's calm face became an instant symbol of unshakable composure, while Troy Miller's stunned expression froze him in the eternal pose of humiliation. Troy didn't leave his apartment that morning. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Texts, calls, notifications, all variations of laughter. Friends sent him clips with crying, laughing emojis. His coworkers tagged him in posts. His own face was now the internet's favorite punchline. Sleepy Troy was trending by noon. His mother tried to call, but he couldn't answer. He threw his phone across the room, but even that didn't silence it. The laughter kept coming from everywhere. At first, he tried to tell himself it didn't matter. He'd been drunk. It was one stupid night. People would forget. But the internet didn't forget. The more he tried to ignore it, the louder it became. At work, the dealership manager pulled him aside. "We can't have this kind of attention, Troy. Customers are talking. I'm sorry." He wasn't sorry at all. By afternoon, Troy was out of a job and out of patience. He drove aimlessly through the outskirts of town, rage simmering like oil on a hot pan. Every gas station, every diner had the video playing on someone's phone. He felt their eyes on him even when no one was looking. He stopped at a bar just outside of town, the same one where he had laughed 2 nights earlier. The same bartender was there polishing glasses. She raised an eyebrow when she saw him. "Heard you had a rough night," she said quietly. Troy forced a laugh. "You and everybody else." She slid him a beer without asking. "Maybe take it as a lesson, huh?" He glared at her, the old anger rising. "A lesson? You think that old man taught me something?" "I think he tried," she said softly, then turned away before he could answer. He sat there for hours, staring at the bubbles rising in his glass. In his mind, the scene replayed over and over: the punch, the stillness, that calm stare that said everything without saying a word. It wasn't just the embarrassment. It was what he had seen in that man's eyes. There had been no fear, no anger, no triumph, just patience, like he'd already known how it would end. By sunset, Troy's humiliation had turned into something darker, a need to erase the memory. He scrolled through comments online until he couldn't stand it anymore. Bro punched himself unconscious. This is what happens when ego meets experience. The floor caught his pride. Each one was another jab, another bruise. The world had taken one moment and turned it into his identity. Meanwhile, Chuck Norris went on with his life as if nothing had happened. Reporters tried to contact him, but he didn't respond. He wasn't interested in explaining himself. He didn't need to defend anything. Those who knew him personally weren't surprised. This wasn't the first time he'd been provoked, and it wouldn't be the last. His days followed the same rhythm training early in the morning, teaching a small group of kids martial arts in the afternoon, and spending his evenings with his wife at their ranch. At the community dojo, he spoke to the children about balance. People think strength is about how hard you can hit, he told them as they sat cross-legged on the mat. But real strength is how calm you can stay when someone's trying to shake you. One of the kids raised his hand. Like when you fought that guy on the street? Chuck smiled faintly. That wasn't a fight, he said. That was just a lesson someone wasn't ready to learn yet. The clip of that interview went mildly viral too, but nowhere near as much as the first one. The world didn't want wisdom, it wanted spectacle. Troy understood that. He saw the way everyone was laughing, and he realized that no amount of words would change what people believed. In the public eye, he wasn't a man anymore. He was a joke, a meme, a 30-second loop of failure. A week later, Troy sat in his apartment with the blinds drawn, a bottle of whiskey half empty on the table. His TV was on mute, showing a late-night host reenacting the punch heard round the internet. The audience laughed and clapped. He couldn't hear them, but he didn't have to. The laughter was already in his head. He gripped the bottle tighter, his reflection warping in the dark glass. In that moment, a thought took root, sharp and poisonous. If one punch had destroyed him, then maybe another could save him. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his messages until he found his old friends, the same ones who'd laughed the first time, then gone quiet once the world turned against him. He sent a message. We're doing this again. My way this time. The replies came slowly. One said, You're crazy. Another said, He's not some actor, Troy. He's the real deal. The last one read, You sure you want to lose twice? He stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back, He got lucky once. That's all. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, a storm gathering on the horizon. It wasn't rain yet, just pressure, waiting for the right moment to break. The next afternoon, Chuck was back on his bench, sipping tea instead of coffee this time, the breeze carrying the faint hum of cicadas. He could feel it in the air, the tension, the shift in rhythm. Trouble was returning. He set his cup down slowly, eyes narrowing toward the end of the street. Some storms, he thought, don't learn the first time. And somewhere not far away, Troy Miller was finishing his drink, pocketing his phone, and telling 3 men that it was time to get back what the world had taken. None of them realized they were about to walk straight into the lesson of their lives. The storm that had been building inside Troy Miller for days finally broke. By Friday evening, the Texas air was thick and electric, a strange quiet settling over the streets as if the world knew what was about to happen. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over Main Street, the same street where it all began. Chuck Norris sat once again on his usual bench outside the cafe, legs crossed, a paper cup of green tea balanced in one hand. He wasn't meditating exactly, but his stillness had the same weight as prayer. For him, the world had become a practice of listening. Every sound, the rustle of wind, the low hum of engines, the distant laughter of children, was part of the same rhythm. Peace wasn't something he reached for anymore. It simply followed him. But tonight, there was a disturbance in that rhythm. He felt it before he saw it. 4 sets of footsteps, steady and deliberate, echoing faintly off the pavement. He exhaled slowly, setting his tea down on the bench beside him. Troy led the way, the same fire in his chest that had burned since the first humiliation, now mixed with something new. Desperation. Behind him came 3 of his old friends, Ryan, Duke, and Colt. They had all been drinking, though not enough to dull the edge of fear beneath their bravado. Ryan carried his phone, already recording. They wanted proof this time, a video that would show the world a different ending. There he is, Troy muttered, his jaw tightening. Same place, like he's waiting for me. Ryan snorted. You sure this is smart, man? It's not about smart, Troy shot back. It's about respect. Duke cracked his knuckles. Respect's got to be earned. Chuck didn't turn as they approached. He could feel their anger before he heard their voices. The air around them was heavy, unbalanced, the kind of presence that spoke louder than words. Evening, Troy called out. His voice was calmer than last time, but it carried a tremor beneath it. Chuck finally turned his head slightly. You again? You remember me, Troy said, stepping closer. Hard to forget a man who's still fighting the same battle, Chuck replied. His tone wasn't mocking, but it cut all the same. Troy's eyes narrowed. You think you're better than me? No, Chuck said softly, just quieter. The words hung in the air. Behind Troy, Ryan gave a nervous laugh, trying to mask his unease. Man, you hear this guy? He thinks he's some kind of monk. Chuck rose slowly from the bench, unfolding his frame with the ease of a man who didn't need to hurry. Though age had lined his face, there was something in his posture, that quiet authority that made the four men instinctively take half a step back. You don't want to do this, Chuck said simply. Troy sneered. You gonna stop us, old man? Chuck's gaze was steady, almost sorrowful. I don't have to stop you. You'll do that yourselves. The first swing came from Ryan. His nerves had pushed him over the edge, and his fist cut through the air in a messy arc. Chuck barely moved. A turn of the shoulders, a shift of weight, and Ryan's arm was caught and redirected in a single fluid motion. His body followed helplessly, spinning with the momentum until Chuck guided him gently but firmly to the ground. It looked effortless, more like a dance than a fight. Ryan gasped as his arm twisted in on itself, the pain blooming sharp and sudden. Chuck eased the pressure just enough to let him breathe. Don't fight what's already leaving you, he murmured. Duke lunged next, his punch wide and heavy. Chuck stepped aside, using his opponent's speed against him. Duke stumbled forward, caught off balance, and with one sweep of the leg, he found himself flat on his back, the air knocked from his lungs. Colt came in from behind, arms wrapping around Chuck's shoulders in a clumsy attempt to hold him. Chuck bent slightly, hooked an arm under Colt's, and shifted his hips. In a blink, Colt was airborne, landing hard but harmlessly on the pavement beside his friends. It had taken no more than 8 seconds. 4 men down, the street echoing with nothing but their ragged breathing. Chuck stood still, adjusting his sleeve, the same composure unbroken. He looked down at Troy, who had stayed back until now, his fists trembling, not from fear, but from disbelief. You're still leading with your ego, Chuck said quietly, and your ego keeps getting knocked out. Troy clenched his jaw, anger twisting inside him. You think you're some kind of saint? You just like making people look weak. Chuck's voice dropped, calm but unyielding. I don't make anyone weak. I just stop pretending they're strong. The street was silent except for the hum of a passing car and the faint rustle of wind. Chuck turned away, ready to leave, but Troy's voice stopped him. You're walking away again, he shouted. That's what cowards do. Chuck paused, back still turned. You can't call someone a coward for refusing to join your war. He took a step forward, but Troy wasn't done. He ran at him, one last desperate attempt to reclaim what pride he had left. Chuck turned, his movement so smooth it barely looked human. His palm met Troy's chest, not violently but decisively. The air left Troy's body in a rush. He dropped to his knees, gasping, the world spinning. Chuck looked down at him, eyes neither cruel nor triumphant. You came here to fight the world again, he said, but all you ever hit is yourself. He knelt slightly, meeting Troy's stunned gaze. You don't understand yet, but one day you will. Peace isn't what you find. It's what you stop running from. Then with quiet dignity, he turned and walked away down the street. The phone Ryan had dropped during the scuffle lay blinking with its camera light still on. It had captured everything. Every fall, every movement, every word. That night, the second video went viral before the moon had fully risen. This one was even shorter. 8 seconds of chaos followed by stillness. 4 men against one, and the one never raising a fist. The caption read, Chuck Norris, 0 injuries. 4 egos destroyed. But beyond the jokes and the memes, something deeper began to shift. People noticed the way Chuck never struck back, never looked angry. They saw his restraint, his control, his strange gentleness, even in the middle of violence. The comments changed from mockery to awe. That's not fighting, that's mastery. He didn't defend himself, he just redirected the universe. Troy saw it all from the glow of his laptop screen, sitting in the dark of his apartment. The sound of his own voice from the video echoed in his head, full of rage and emptiness. He replayed the moment Chuck looked at him, the stillness in those eyes, the quiet disappointment that hurt worse than any strike. He didn't smash the laptop. He didn't shout. He just sat there, the realization sinking in like a slow tide. This wasn't about the world anymore. It wasn't even about Chuck. It was about him and the fight he'd been losing long before that first punch. In another part of town, far from the noise of the internet and the glare of headlines, Chuck Norris sat in his quiet living room, a soft lamp casting golden light on the walls. His wife, Catherine, entered with 2 cups of tea. "You saw the video?" she asked gently. He nodded. "It's everywhere again." "You didn't have to fight them," she said. "I didn't," he replied, taking a sip. "They fought themselves. I just helped them see it." She studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You think they'll learn?" He set his cup down. "Pain's a good teacher," he said softly, "but humility, that's graduation." Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees. The night was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But somewhere deep inside, the first spark of understanding had begun to flicker in the man who once thought peace was weakness. Troy Miller had lost another battle, but this time, for the first time, he had also begun to listen. Months passed, but the noise never left Troy Miller's head. Even when the internet moved on to newer scandals, newer victims, he still heard the laughter. His name had become a synonym for failure. In town, people whispered when he walked past, and even those who didn't recognize him seemed to stare longer than they should. He tried to hide behind sunglasses in silence, but shame has a way of speaking louder than any word. After the second video, his friends had drifted away one by one. Ryan deleted his number. Duke stopped answering his calls. Colt moved to another state. No one wanted to be associated with the guy who lost twice to a man old enough to be their grandfather. The few who still talked to him did so with pity, which stung worse than mockery. He sold his car, then his television, then finally his small apartment. With nowhere else to go, he took a job at an auto repair shop on the outskirts of a neighboring town. It was quiet work, dirty, repetitive, and thankless. But it gave him something to focus on other than the emptiness. He arrived early, left late, and spoke little. The men there didn't ask questions. They'd seen broken men before. The world had a habit of producing them. At night after closing, Troy often sat alone in the garage, staring at the metal skeletons of cars under repair. The smell of oil and dust reminded him of his father's old workshop. The old man had been hard on him, not cruel but relentless, teaching him that strength meant never backing down, never showing weakness. He had believed that for most of his life, until he met a man who had shown him something different. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that calm face again, the way Chuck Norris had stood unshaken as his fury collapsed into air. The memory burned deeper than any bruise. Sometimes he tried to convince himself that he didn't care, that the old man had humiliated him just to make a point. But the more he replayed that night, the more he realized it wasn't humiliation that haunted him. It was peace, that effortless composure, that balance between stillness and strength. It was what he'd spent his whole life pretending to have. One evening after the shop closed, Troy washed his hands and looked at his reflection in the small cracked mirror above the sink. The man who stared back was unrecognizable. Tired eyes, a fading bruise on his jawline that had taken months to disappear, and a quietness in his expression that hadn't been there before. For the first time in years, he didn't feel anger. He just felt lost. The decision came suddenly, though it had been building for weeks. He took the old truck he had been fixing for the shop owner and drove out toward the open highway, the sun bleeding into the horizon ahead of him. He didn't know where he was going until he saw the familiar sign, Main Street, the little town where it all began. His hands tightened on the wheel as he turned toward it, heart thudding not from fear, but from something heavier, the need to face what he had been running from. When he reached the cafe, it was just before sunset, the same hour as both encounters before. The world seemed unchanged, the same creaking sign, the same soft hum of the wind through the trees, and the same wooden bench by the sidewalk. And there he was, sitting just as before, as if time itself had refused to move him. Chuck Norris. Troy parked the truck and stepped out slowly. His boots scuffed against the pavement, echoing louder than they should have. Chuck looked up but didn't move, his eyes studying Troy with quiet recognition. "I'm not here to fight," Troy said quickly, raising his hand slightly as if to prove it. Chuck nodded once. "Good. Fighting was never your problem. Listening was." The words hit harder than a punch, but they were true. Troy exhaled and took a step closer. "I just want to understand," he said, his voice low. Chuck tilted his head. "Understand what?" "How you do it," Troy said. "How you stay calm when someone's trying to get under your skin. How you don't get angry. You don't even flinch." Chuck looked back toward the sunset, his profile outlined by the fading gold. "You're asking the wrong question." Troy frowned. "Then what's the right one?" Chuck turned to face him. "Why can't you?" For a long moment, Troy said nothing. The question hung between them, heavier than any accusation. He tried to speak but couldn't find words. His throat felt tight, his chest hollow. Chuck stood, his movements slow but deliberate. "You think fighting makes you strong because it drowns out the noise in your head," he said softly. "When you're swinging, you can't hear your fear. You can't hear your shame. That's why men like you crave it. Not for victory, for silence." Troy looked down at his hands, calloused and stained from work. They trembled slightly. "You think I like being angry?" "I think you've made a home in it," Chuck replied, "because it's easier than facing what's underneath." The words stung, but they didn't feel cruel. They felt like truth. Troy swallowed hard. "So what do I do?" Chuck stepped closer, stopping just in front of him. "Stop fighting everything that isn't fighting you." The simplicity of it made Troy blink. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," Chuck said. "Took me half my life to learn it. You don't tame the storm by shouting at it. You do it by learning to breathe in the middle of it." The two men stood there in silence, the golden light fading into blue. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a car engine hummed, and the town lights flickered to life one by one. Finally, Troy spoke, his voice quiet. "Teach me." Chuck gave a faint smile. "I already did," he said. "You just didn't realize the lesson until now." He gestured toward the bench. "Sit." They both sat side by side. The world seemed to slow, the sounds of the city fading into a gentle hum. Chuck folded his hands in his lap. "Close your eyes," he said. "Breathe." Troy hesitated, then obeyed. "Now," Chuck continued, "imagine every fight you've ever had, every insult, every time someone disrespected you. Feel it." Troy's fist clenched unconsciously. Faces flashed in his mind. The bar fights, the arguments, his father's disappointed glare, the laughter online, and finally Chuck's calm eyes before the fall. "Now," Chuck said quietly, "let it go. One by one." Troy tried. It wasn't easy. He saw each memory fading, some slower than others, until at last there was only quiet. "What do you feel now?" Chuck asked. "Empty," Troy said after a moment. "Good," Chuck murmured. "That's where peace starts." When Troy opened his eyes again, the sky had turned dark. The street lamps glowed softly and the crickets had started their nightly song. He looked at Chuck, who was watching him with the faintest smile. "You ever regret it?" Troy asked. "All the fighting? All the violence?" Chuck shook his head slowly. "Regret's not useful. Reflection is. Violence is like fire. It can cook your food or burn your house down. Depends how you hold it." Troy nodded, the meaning sinking in. "I don't think I'm built for peace like you." "No one is," Chuck said. "Peace isn't something you're born with. It's something you earn every time you choose not to hit back." Troy let out a long breath. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove I was tough." Chuck looked at him, his eyes kind but firm. "Then start proving you can be gentle. That's harder." For the first time in as long as he could remember, Troy smiled. Small, uncertain, but real. The sound of the wind brushed past them, carrying the faint hum of a guitar from the nearby cafe. It felt different this time. Calmer. As he stood to leave, Chuck called after him. "Troy?" He turned. Chuck gave a slow nod. "You were brave to come back." Troy hesitated, then smiled again. Guess I finally learned how not to lead with my ego. Chuck nodded. Then maybe you've learned how to lead with your heart instead. When Troy walked away, the night no longer felt like judgment. It felt like possibility. Somewhere deep inside, something had shifted. Not a sudden revelation, but the slow beginning of a different kind of strength. And for Chuck Norris, watching from his bench as the younger man disappeared into the darkness, that was enough. The hardest battles he knew were the ones no one saw. Time, as it always does, moved quietly onward. The months that followed brought subtle but steady change. Troy Miller's life, once a storm of anger and self-pity, began to take on the rhythm of something slower, steadier, more deliberate. He didn't return to the old bars or the old crowd. He didn't look for fights anymore. The first few weeks were strange. The absence of conflict left a kind of emptiness he didn't know how to fill. But that emptiness slowly became space, and in that space he began to breathe again. He kept his job at the repair shop, though people there started to notice a difference. He was patient now, calm even when things went wrong. Once, when a customer shouted at him about a delay, the old Troy would have snapped, thrown a wrench or a word sharp enough to draw blood. But now he simply listened, apologized, and fixed the mistake. His co-workers exchanged glances. They didn't say anything, but everyone could feel it. The man had changed. On weekends, he began driving back to the small town where it all began. Sometimes he would stop by the cafe where Chuck Norris often sat, and if the older man was there, they'd share tea and talk. It wasn't about fighting or philosophy. Sometimes it was about nothing at all. Weather, music, the quiet discipline of staying alive without needing to prove it. For Chuck, these were the conversations that mattered most. He could see the change in Troy's posture, the calm in his breathing, the softening around his eyes. The storm that had once lived behind them had quieted. One afternoon, Chuck said, "You look different." Troy smiled faintly. "Maybe I just stopped being angry at the wind." Chuck chuckled. "That's a start." Troy trained at Chuck's small dojo for a while, not to fight, but to learn control. The movements were slow, graceful, about balance, not power. Chuck's lessons were simple but exacting. The way to turn the body without wasting energy, the way to breathe through resistance, the way to see before acting. But more than technique, he taught him patience. A strike isn't for hurting, he told him once. It's for stopping something that shouldn't continue. Troy took those words to heart. He didn't just repeat them, he lived them. And life, as if testing him, soon gave him the chance to prove it. It happened on a humid evening at a gas station outside the city. Troy had stopped for fuel after work when he heard shouting near the parking lot. Two young men, maybe 20 or so, were squared off beside a pickup truck, their voices sharp, their anger rising. One shoved the other hard against the door, and a small crowd began to form, phones already lifted to record. The sound was all too familiar, the pulse of pride before violence. Troy could have ignored it. He almost did. But then he saw the fear in one boy's eyes. The same fear he'd once felt himself, that desperate, blind need to prove something that didn't need proving. He walked toward them slowly, not shouting, not rushing, just presence. "Hey," he said, his tone calm but firm. Both young men turned. "This isn't worth it." The taller one scoffed. "Stay out of it, man." "I am out of it," Troy replied. "You're the ones that's still in it." The smaller one looked uncertain now, glancing between them. The taller shoved him again. "Mind your business." Troy stepped closer, just enough to catch his attention. "You're angry, and you think hitting him will make it stop. It won't. It'll just move the anger from your chest to your hands, and that's when it owns you." The boy froze. Something in Troy's voice, the steadiness, the quiet authority, cut through the chaos. He hesitated, breathing hard, then stepped back. The other boy did the same. The crowd murmured. Someone whispered, "Wait, is that the guy from those old Chuck Norris videos?" Troy didn't hear it. He just nodded once to the two young men. "Go home," he said simply. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone." They separated without another word. The phones lowered. The moment dissolved like smoke in the evening air. By morning, the video was everywhere again. But this time, it wasn't a clip of humiliation or violence. It was of a man stopping a fight with nothing but calm words and quiet strength. The caption read, "He didn't throw a punch, he threw peace." Comments flooded in, not with laughter, but with admiration. That's growth. He learned. Chuck Norris must be proud. When Chuck saw the clip, he was sitting in his living room with his wife, Catherine. She entered holding 2 cups of tea, setting one beside him. "You saw the video?" she asked. He nodded. "I did." She smiled softly. "You changed him." He shook his head. "No, life did. I just showed him where to look." They sat together in silence for a while, the glow from the television fading into the soft light of evening. Outside, the Texas wind moved through the trees, gentle and steady, the sound almost like breathing. "Do you think he'll stay on that path?" Catherine asked after a moment. Chuck took a slow sip of tea before answering. "Once a man finds peace after drowning in his own anger," he said, "he never forgets how to breathe again." They fell quiet again, both watching the horizon through the open window. The city lights shimmered in the distance, tiny reflections of stars caught in glass. Chuck leaned back, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. He thought of Troy, of that first night and the punch that started it all, how the boy's fury had crashed against stillness and shattered, and how, from that shattering, something true had begun to grow. He had seen it happen before. Men who thought power lived in their fists eventually learned that the real fight was never against others, but against the noise within themselves. And when that battle was finally won, what remained wasn't weakness, it was clarity. The wind whispered again outside, brushing through the open window. Catherine rested her hand gently on his. He didn't speak, and neither did she. They didn't have to. The night deepened, and for a moment, everything seemed perfectly still. The kind of stillness that didn't need to prove itself, that didn't demand attention. It simply was. And there, in that quiet, unspoken truth, Chuck Norris sat with the peace of a man who had long ago learned the final lesson of strength, that real power doesn't roar, it whispers. And that whisper, once heard, can silence 1,000 storms. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button now and don't miss what's coming next. The next story will change the way you see everything. Share this video with your friends so they can experience it too, and keep watching. The next one might shock you even more.